Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
Okay, I have been given the privilege to introduce our speaker for tonight. She is from New Orleans. She got sober when she was 27, and she just got her 30-year coin a week ago. This is Angela.
I got a cheat sheet too. Thank you, Catherine, and I'd like to thank the committee, Arthur in particular, who listened to my, I don't know what talk you heard, but it probably won't be the one you hear tonight. James, who has been a constant presence in my sobriety since the day that I got sober. And just for you guys, I know a lot of work goes into putting in these and putting on any kind of event like this, and it's fun, but it's a lot of work, and so it's really an honor and a privilege, you know, to be asked to come here and be with you tonight. My name is Angela, and I'm an alcoholic. Hey, Angela. And my sobriety date is April 22nd, 1983. That is really through the grace of a loving God and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, the men and women. I have some sort of good news and bad news for Conley over here. It also affects Rose, who is my second sponsor. And I've only had 2 sponsors, but I've had 4 husbands, so you know sponsorship's real important to me. And, you know, the conference, the 2013 conference, the General Service Conference, raised the age of an old-timer to 50 years. Rose thinks they do that on purpose to her, you know. Every time she gets a benchmark, so they've raised the benchmark. The immediate past trustee told me that the other day. I thought it was funny, so I thought I'd share it with you. There's always enough to keep us to our right size here, right? You know, when I had my anniversary, I got these well wishes from everybody. They come on the internet, and friends that I've met at conferences and people that I know. And one fella always sends a joke, and I never know any appropriate jokes to tell at AA conferences because I only know dirty jokes. And I know every dirty joke that I ever heard from the earliest childhood, and I can repeat all of them to you and just go right back to where it was. But this one was really good, and it was a woman who had immigrated to the United States, and she was ready to become a citizen. And so she was standing in front of the judge that was going to swear in, and he said, "Raise your right hand," and she did. And he said, "Do you promise to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America and protect it from all enemies, domestic and foreign?" Her hand went down. She says, "Do I have to do that all by myself?" And it was followed with, "No, you don't, and neither do we. You know, we don't have to do this alone." You know, the very first word in how this thing works is we. This is what we did. You know, and my personal adventures before and after, you know, would just take so long. I have been sober more than half of my life. I'm 39 again, and hey, I did notice that all the old-timers looked a lot older than I did, but that also seems to happen with the girls I went to school with when I run into them in the grocery store. I just don't know what the problem is. You know, I'm from New Orleans. I'm right outside of New Orleans. 9 Mile Point. 9 Mile Point is an historic point on the Mississippi River, and it's 9 miles upriver from the old port of New Orleans. And my father found that spot, that piece of land, back in the 50s. And we moved there. He built a house there, and we moved there when I was 11. And there was nothing there but the river and my brother and sisters. And I'm the oldest of 5 children, and I hated kids. I hated the kids that, you know, I had to help my mother take care of. And in there, I was very lonely there. I read mystery stories, and I'd lay up on that levee on the Mississippi River, and I'd take the encyclopedia that we had, and it had in it a flags of all nations. So I would identify the ships and what countries they were from. And, when I did this, I would say these little prayers, these little prayers that I didn't know were prayers. But there was one that was a constant: God, please send me a sailor to take me away from here. I don't know what I was thinking. I had never heard anything. I didn't know any sailors, and, I had never heard anything good about them or bad about them, except what Mama would tell me about going to the USO in Biloxi back in the, God knows, prehistoric times. But anyway, we were there, and like I say, I was the oldest of 5 children, and so I had a lot of responsibility. I had a mother who drank alcoholically from my earliest memories include alcohol. Alcohol was a staple in our home. When the 666 number came up and there was the woo, I said, boy, you can tell you in the Bible Belt up here, they don't know what that means down in New Orleans. But, it really was. It was like butter, bread, gin, detergent. And when I was 12 years old, I could drive the Plymouth station wagon across the Huey P. Long Bridge and go to the grocery store and buy gin, cigarettes, bread, butter, and whatever else was on the grocery list. I was, and I also partook of those things, And I don't remember my very first drink. I'm sure that it was in utero. But I do remember the very first time that that alcohol changed the way that I felt. And, my grandmother was a musician. I come from a family of musicians. We all think that we sing better than Barbra Streisand, but none of us do. And, but my grandmother played piano. She lived in Las Vegas at the time, and my uncle played the guitar, and they would play with these big bands. And once a year, it was just this big event. It was this big event when Meemaw was coming to town, because she'd always bring a big suitcase full of a bunch of crap, literally crap, dice and beads from Circus. And let me tell you, where I come from, boys wear beads. Y'all should put your beads on, We go, hey, throw us. They would do a lot of things for beads where I come from. Stuff I might have even done at some point, I don't know. But my grandmother would come, and it was this big event, and we'd have a big party, and she'd make gumbo and, all this. And so this one particular year she comes, we're living in the house on River Road. So I was 11 or 12, I think I was 12. And she in addition to the other things that she brought us this year, she brought us shot glasses from all the different casinos. So she had the shot glasses lined up. And by that time of the evening, my daddy was home from work. Where I grew up, everybody had the same house, one mama, one daddy, one car. Things were just same, So if you had something exotic come in, like shot glasses from Las Vegas, Anyway, she lines them up across the bar, and I have a brother who is, I don't know how, he's younger than me, not much younger, because Mama had 5 kids in 7 years. And, what do you do? Wherever you find 4 Catholics, she'll always find a 5th. Well, that panty-waist brother was sitting next to me. Meemaw pours Jack Daniels in one and Jack Daniels in another. And she says, now what you do is you like this, and you drink it straight back. And so I did, and oh, God, it felt like I drank fire, And my brother was like, ugh. I said, oh, give that to me. And I drank his, too. And then in a little while, I got her to give me another one. And then before I knew it, she was playing the piano, and Mom and I were jitterbugging, and I could dance so good, and the harmony all fell into place. Life was wonderful, and I tell you that story because it never ever got any better for me than it was that night. It just got worse. If that elusive feeling, if the way that I felt, the comfort of my family, the warmth of that good food, gumbo, seafood gumbo, the music that I loved so much, and I had so much of in my life, and it never got better than that. And the next time on purpose that I got drunk, I got drunk on purpose, There was a slumber party at our house, and this time the booze, we folded boys in with the booze, so then we had double trouble. And, and it never got any better than that. And like I tell you, I guess I told you, I was raised Catholic, and we drank, the priest drank, everybody drank. But, somewhere along the line, the boys and the education became less important to me, and, I found myself in a situation with this boy that was not the boy my daddy wanted me to date or see. And I don't know how it happened, but I was pregnant. And I found out that I was pregnant on a Thursday evening, and Friday at 11 o'clock, the very next day, I was married to him in a brown pantsuit in the Jefferson Parish Courthouse and sent off to live with his parents. I broke my father's heart. He had such high hopes for me, but I was a good student. I didn't have to study to make good grades because, I think all of us, if you're an alcoholic of my variety, we're pretty damn smart. We're crafty. We have good comprehension skills, So, it broke my father's heart. You see, he hadn't been able to reach the things he aspired for because he had a terrible accident when he was a young man. And so he remained physically handicapped the rest of his life and died as a result of that, as part of that, when he was a young man. And, it just broke his heart because everything that he wanted for himself, that he couldn't have, I was going to have. And, it changed the way that my brother and sisters were parented and raised. And it changed our whole lives. I'll tell you this, that my brother was at a Catholic boarding school, and he'd go he'd go to the school on Sunday evenings and come home to the house on Friday evenings, and I would go pick him up. And on the Friday that I was married, which was in November of 1971, I didn't go pick him up. Somebody else went and picked him up. And when he got home, he goes, "Where's Angela?" And they said, "She doesn't live here anymore." And, 30 years went by before he told me how deeply that affected him. I never even thought that it affected him. I had no idea that it had disturbed my brother. How injured and fearful he had been that she just doesn't live here anymore. She screwed up. She's gone. You're next. And, that was how he took it. That really was how he took it. He told me this in a conversation when he told me that he couldn't buy a loaf of bread because he can't make a commitment to eat a loaf of bread. People say, what does your brother do? He lives out in Portland, Oregon, and he's Peter Pan. If you're ever out there, look him up. He just, that's just the way it is. I got the hell away from there, and I got the hell away from the church, and I got the hell away from everything that I thought impeded my ability to be a free spirit, because that was what I wanted, to be a free spirit. It was the times too, the sex, drugs, rock and roll, and I was into all of it. It didn't matter what it was. If you had it, I wanted it, and if you could do one, I could do 10. And that's the way it was, and that's the way it always was. And things got bad, and I'm here to tell you that I have visited the inside of a number of jails throughout the southeast United States. I can tell you what my least favorite was. I could tell you what my most favorite was, and I can tell you that they were all related. They were directly related to my alcoholism. And the other things that I did, that, I just can't stand it anymore when I hear somebody in AA say, well, and I had outside issues. Crap, they were drugs. Jesus Christ, they even talk about it in the big book. Get over yourself. Sometimes to control my drinking, sometimes to enhance my drinking, but it started with alcohol. And on that very last day, when I laid in the Peacock Motel on Veterans Boulevard trying to drink myself to death, that's what it was. It was alcohol. And I changed alcohol. I used to like to drink those White Russians, but that had a lot of calories in it. And, you couldn't get enough milk in to get a good buzz going on, And so, by the time I stopped drinking, I think I was about 26 when I got there. I'll tell you how I got this sobriety date. I was drinking scotch neat. Don't even put any ice in it. Just give me the scotch. I seemed to have less side effects. Like it seemed to stay down longer. that's how it was. You know, I ended up in this hotel. I think there was a real scandal about that place a while back when Jimmy Swaggart went in there and did something he shouldn't have been doing. But anyway, I ended up over there, you know, and I was trying to die. You know, I couldn't, you know, I mean, I was at that place. Everybody sitting in this room who is drunk like I drank gets to that place where, you know, you just can't get drunk and you just can't get sober, you know, and it's just, it was so painful. It was so excruciatingly painful. Every day hurt so bad. I was in so much pain. I had so much guilt. I was so ashamed. You know, and there I was. And for some reason, well, there were a variety of reasons, but I ended up calling my doctor. You know, he was a good guy. He was a really good guy. And he said, I said, Dr. Bryan, I think I'm dying. And he says, you're probably right, Angela. And I said, I need some help. And he goes, you're probably right, Angela. I think I need to come to a hospital. He said, you're right, Angela. You do. I'm going to have this lady call you. And this lady called me, and I cannot tell you what she said to me. I can't, but somehow she talked me in to going over to the nut house. Well, you know, when one alcoholic has planted in the mind of another the true nature of their disease, they can never be the same again. And when they put you in a straitjacket in the nut house, I can tell you your life is going to change. This woman, as it turned out, I only met her one time, and you know, it was a month or so later, but this woman was a psychiatrist, and she was pretty well known in Alcoholics Anonymous. In the 80s, she had been sober over 40 years, and she'd moved down to New Orleans to retire. And my doctor's father and this woman went to medical school together. And she was a lady. She was in AA. She was a real lady. She was in AA. And she knew that I needed to get that kind of help, the kind of help that they give you in the nut house, not the kind that they give you with the button that goes up and down. And there I was, you know. And I, you know, when the door closed, you know, I was locked in there, and I don't, you know, I didn't consciously make a decision to go lock myself up somewhere. That was like jail, but I had. And I had decided after a few days of watching people come and go that I would just tell them I was leaving. And I mean, after all, I came voluntarily, and I'd leave whenever I wanted to. And so I did tell them that, and they said, oh, yes, is that you want to leave? Okay. Well, then they filled out these papers, and I was reading over these papers, and they were going to have me sign these papers, which said that I would be evaluated by the coroner. Isn't that the person that does dead people? I mean, that's what I think coroners are. And that if the coroner thought that I was a danger to myself or society, then he would send me to Mandeville. Now, you know, if you live in New Orleans, Mandeville is the big nut house. I mean, that's where people go for the therapy. And the only treatment that I had ever heard of in all of my life was the treatment, the electric shock therapy, because we would know people who, oh, she had a nervous breakdown, and she'd come back and the eyes would be blank and no more makeup and running into the walls. I mean, they were doing that stuff. You know, so that's what I thought treatment meant. I didn't know anything about treatment. I knew a little bit about alcoholism because I had an uncle, my mother's brother, who would come over from Pascagoula or Goche, wherever he was living at the time, to New Orleans, and he would go to the Bridge House. And the Bridge House was a place where when you had no other place to go, you could go there and they'd dry you up and give you a bed. There was about 7 or 8 beds back then, you know. And Lord, he'd get the religion, you know, he'd take that big book and he'd go thumping on it. I brought mine tonight in case I needed to thump on it a bit. You know, but he'd go back to the family, you know, and they'd pray in the rosary, and, you know, he'd get on that soapbox and he'd be drunk the next day. But, you know, when he'd string together a little bit of sobriety, you know, he had them convinced that there was some sort of cult that they needed to pray him out of. And so, you know, I mean, the alcoholism was, I understood a little bit about the alcoholism, and the only thing that I understood about recovering from it is that you can't do what Uncle Joe did. You know, that was bad news. But anyway, I got over to this place, you know, and I immediately took those papers away when they told me the coroner was going to have to see me. You know, I'll tell you that this is a really important thing. You know, I was still under the influence. But I complied. It was the first time that I believe I'd ever complied to something. I said, all right. I surrendered because I was afraid of the outcome. I was fearful that if I did not take those papers back, something much worse was going to happen to me. And I'd been in a straitjacket for a few days because I wanted to get out of there. I was thirsty, Even I understood in the state I was in that I was thirsty and I needed to leave. After a period of time, I don't know how long a time, I got sent to another part of this hospital, and there were people in clothes walking around reading books. This is your group, and this is your person, and I was in treatment. And I kept wondering, I wonder what I'm in treatment for. I didn't know what was wrong with me. This nurse, I'm still in touch with her. She runs a treatment center for women. She's not an AA. She just loves drunks. I mean, there are people sicker than us, I will tell you. She runs this treatment center for what's a long-term place in Orlando, and she and I still communicate. And she looked at me one day and she shook her head. She was like a throwback, She had her hair down below her waist. Her jeans were too short, and I had no problem telling her that she just wasn't dressed appropriately. And she looked down at me one day and she says, we have a name for people like you. And I really wanted. I said, really? I was interested because I didn't know what I was in treatment for. She said, yeah. We do, honey. You're an alcoholic. I will tell you, to this day, I don't think that I have ever had a feeling more desperate and sad and lonely as the knowledge that what she was saying to me was true. It was an excruciating reality because I kind of knew what was coming. I knew what was coming, and I didn't know how to do what was going to be asked of me. I stayed there for, I don't know, God knows how long I was there, but on April 22nd, 1983, they said that I could go on pass. And I had a boyfriend and a husband, and I had business I needed to take care of. And they said, now you're going, you get 24 hours, and you have to go to a meeting and get this paper. So I'm like, what kind of meeting do you want me to go to? They said, an AA meeting, idiot. People had been coming to the place where we were, and they had been talking at us, but I hadn't heard anything they said. I hadn't. You can't. Here's the deal. What I believe today is that, I can't teach an alcoholic how to do anything. I got only one thing, I have my experience that I can share, and somebody in this room tonight might hear one little sentence that will help them. But, other than that, I got nothing to teach you. I can only tell you what I did and share my life with you, my personal adventures before and after. And but they would come and they would talk at us and stuff, and I didn't pay attention to them. But I went over to this meeting because it was convenient. It was like 3 blocks down from this place, and then I could go on about my very important business. And at that meeting, they were giving awards. They were giving awards to people for things. And I never got an award, but I thought I should have one. After all, I'd been there for a very long time. So I go back the next day and I tell them, I went over there because they wanted you to tell them what happened at the meeting. They were giving awards. That was the only thing. The chips. They were giving out chips. And I said, I think that if I go back then on Friday, that I could get an award too. And they go, they're not awards, Angela. Those are little reminders of our sobriety. I go, well, what's my sobriety date? And they said, well, why don't you just make it that on your first meeting? Well, you see, I know people who are real invested in their sobriety date. But, I didn't know any better, so I said, okay. And that was April 22nd, 1983. That was my very first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I haven't had a drink or any mood-altering chemical that I've administered to myself in that amount of time. After I'd been sober about 10 years, my daughter said, Mama, really, you did get sober, I think, in January or February of that year. And I started trying to calculate. It was all based on this discussion we had about the Oscars, and I thought, that's ridiculous. After all this time to change my sobriety date so I could have an extra 30 days and beat you. It ain't a contest, and I probably wouldn't have won it anyway. 'Cause, I mean, I don't know. 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 I don't one of the reasons that I stayed in that place and that I complied, and I say complied because I did what I was told to do when I didn't believe that it would work. I didn't want to do what I was instructed to do. And I was instructed. I was directed, I was advised, I was told, I was mandated. You know, and some of these things came from AA members themselves. James maybe even said, go sit over there and sit down and shut up. I did what I was told to do. I complied. And that's what it was. If you look it up, there's a whole lot of difference between compliance and, you know, that compliance I did because my children had been removed from me. You see, I couldn't get sober to get them off of the bus. So their father, who they had very restricted knowledge of, he had a wife, and she came and she picked him up. And they had court orders filed, and they removed my children, and they said that I was an unfit mother. And I was an unfit mother. And it was the most painful thing in my life. Although I didn't want to be a mother to my brother and sisters. You know, I got these kids on purpose. And I didn't want to be called unfit. And I was. So I complied. Because if I complied, then there was a good chance that maybe they could come home. You know, I went to an AA meeting every day. I think that I agree with the 12 and 12 that, you know, step 3 is where the affirmative action takes place. For me, everything happened just in retrospect when I looked back at it that I came. You know, I came to believe, and then I had to make a big decision. And it's so awe-inspiring. I do want to say this before I forget it, you know. Well, you know, one of those children, you know, my children were 8 and 10 when I got sober. And my baby boy is here tonight. He's 38 years old now. And he don't look like a baby to anybody else. He's a grown man. He's got a wife. He's got his own kids, retired after 20 years in the Marine Corps, and now works for a huge company that's not Kmart. We had to get the milk at Kmart today. You know, we come for whatever reason we come, but we stay because we find something that we love. And I complied because I wanted my kids to come home. You know, I wanted it in a way that I've wanted a lot of things. What happens if I really get this? Am I going to be able to do it? Can I? And I was afraid, you know, I'd never done it. I didn't do it right before. And so I wasn't real sure what to do. But, you know, I took this like I took everything else. I took it to Alcoholics Anonymous. And the person who I really wanted to be my sponsor was a man, you know, and they said I couldn't have a man sponsor, even though I got along much better with men than I did with women. I explained that to them, but they still didn't allow it. And so I thought it was a rule. So, like I say, I complied. But this man, his name is Mickey, and I see him now and again. I love him just as much now as I did then. And, you know, he said, Angela, I don't know. He said, all I can tell you is that, you know, we don't just like sober up one day and get the parenting guide. You know, we have to learn how to do this. And, you know, if we're lucky, we get to grow up with our children. I know he's done that, and I know that I've done that with mine. I'm exceedingly grateful. And they were returned to me when I had 9 months of sobriety. And there's a woman who was in treatment, and I went there to talk to the patients, and she said, I'll never forget the day you got your children home back. You said, I went to a meeting that night, and I said, my children, the judge gave me the kids, and I have custody of my children again. And she said, and you cried, and you said that you would never have a Thanksgiving dinner where you didn't cook a turkey again. Because it was in November of 1983. And I haven't. I haven't had a Thanksgiving where I didn't cook a turkey again, because for me that's a very meaningful thing. You know, I wanted this good-looking guy to be my sponsor, and they told me no, so I got this lady, this gray-haired lady, and I didn't think she'd give me too much trouble about the boyfriend and the husband. I didn't think she'd know too much about that. She wouldn't be much interested in those antics. But, boy, I tell you what, she embarrassed me, you know. She really did. She'd say stuff about herself. I'd be so embarrassed for her. I'd say, God, doesn't she know how old she is? You know. It was kind of funny. It was really funny. And when I got sober, you know, when I got sober and where I got sober, you know, people did things differently. I'm with our friend, you know, Tom I from up in North Carolina, who says, you know, one of my concerns about AA today is that we've taken these steps, you know, and we've turned them into an instructional process, you know, and we think that we can teach, you know, one another these things. And, you know, that's not what happened for me. That's not how I learned AA. Nobody sat down and read the big book to me. You know, I don't think I read the big book for a really long time. I couldn't write my name for 6 months, for God's sakes. I mean, I was damaged. I was hurt. My brain was badly injured. I could show up and sit down. I could shut up because they wouldn't let me do anything else. And little by little, you know, and this was made real clear to me. We had this fella a while back that we were dragging around. He came in, it was right after Katrina, and, you know, we didn't have anything we couldn't do anything with these folks, you know. There was no places to send them, and so, you know, we'd pass them from house to house and stuff, and this guy he was in bad shape when he came in. He was shaking and sick, and we were handing him off, and somebody was taking him to a meeting every day, and so he was sitting between me and this guy one day. We were at a noon meeting, and somebody started to read how it works. Now, we read how it works at every single meeting we'd ever taken him to. And he says to the guy, he says, you know, I think they read that yesterday. And that's just an indication of how sick we are, you know. I mean, we think we're all better when we got 2 weeks or 3 weeks. He had 90 days, and that's the first time it occurred to him that he'd heard that before. I appreciated that. I thought I was the only one that found new and exciting things in Alcoholics Anonymous at every meeting I went to, you know. So, you know, I launch into this vigorous course of action. You see, I had no burning bush thing, you know. I didn't. I just complied. I didn't think I was going to stay. I never intended to stay. I didn't intend to come to begin with, and I certainly didn't intend to stay. I just needed to get stuff in order so that I could go on with my life. And, you know, this little gray-haired old lady, you know, she got with me, and we talked about she met me over at that place, and we talked about where I was and how much work I had done, but what did I read, what did I know. She kind of did the Q&A thing. And she says, you know, you need to do this third step. You need to make a decision. And, you know, I had been cast from my church. I think that this is really important. And these were the words that the priest used. He said, I cast you from this church. You are no longer a Catholic. Leave and do not return. He said this to me. I was 16 years old with my baby girl in my arms wanting to get her baptized. And he refused to do it. Now, you know, when it's all you know, because it was all I knew, was that church and that religion, you see, that may as well have been God standing there, casting me out, because that's how I connected those dots. And now here I am these years later, having done all these naughty things, you know, and I'm going to have to make a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand God. And I understood that God had cast me out, never to return. That's what I understood. It was painful. It was excruciatingly painful. You know, it talks about it in our literature. You know, I mean, we're faced with these things. You know, am I going to go in this spiritual direction? Am I going to take what you're offering me here? Or am I going to continue to live the way that I live? And it's so insane that we have to make a decision. We have to make a decision. And I couldn't. I didn't know how. So I went to meetings. I went to 2 meetings a day. I couldn't write or talk or anything, so I went to 2 meetings a day. And we had a character. He's still there. He had 17 years of sobriety when I got sober, so that gives him 47 now. Crazy Roy, we call him. And he's as crazy today as he was 30 years ago. He was in a meeting at this old Boulevard club. The meeting would have to shut down when the train came across the tracks because you couldn't hear a word. It was built under the train tracks, you know. But this particular day, every meeting I went to was on the third step. I don't know if y'all ever had that happen to you, but you got something going on in your life, and every time you go to a meeting, that's what they're talking about, you know? Every meeting was on the third step, and Roy was talking, and he starts talking about, you know, he was from the Ninth Ward, and he talked like God, and, you know, he said those, I didn't think too much of people that talked like that. But anyhow, he was so funny. He really was so funny. It was hard not to pay attention to him. And he talked about, you know, going to church and praying to God and his daddy coming home from work. And God was like a loving father. And, you know, he did all this stuff, you know. And what he did in this crazy, funny story that he told was he painted a picture of a benevolent, loving father who didn't care if I had failed. And would make all things right if I would only allow him to. And it got my interest. It really got my interest. And I sat there and I listened carefully. And I heard what I was supposed to hear. And at the end of that, at the end of his little talk, because he does go on, he said, if there's anybody in this room who's having a problem finding a God as they understand him, just use mine till you get your own. And I went to the house. And I went to the bathroom, and I closed the door, and I got on my knees. And I said, Roy's God, can you manage my life? And I prayed like that for many, many years in AA. Many, many years. After I'd done that, and I told old Ruby I'd done that, she said, well, now it's time that you launch onto this vigorous course of action. I'm going to give you this worksheet, and you're going to do an inventory. Well, now, you know, I thought I was pretty important in that city just because I'd broken a couple of laws. But anyway, she gives me this thing, and I write 1,200,000 pages of crap. I don't know what it was. I can tell you that I was so sick that it didn't even occur to me to lie about anything. But there were several things that I would intentionally omit. I had to. It was important. It was of the utmost importance that I not write those things down on paper because if I got stopped and the police saw this, I could go to jail. And I knew it. And I was pretty damn sure that they had my phone tapped. I was pretty sure that they were listening in on the conversations that I was having with this old woman, you know. And I called her up. I didn't get to go to my sponsor's house and have tea. I had never been to her house. And I needed directions one more time. We didn't have cell phones or GPS or any of that crap. You know, you just had to know how to get where you were going. I said one more time, so she tells me. And right before the phone hangs up, right before it clicks, boy, she caught me. She said, did you write it all down? I said, well, Ruby, there's a few things that maybe I ought to just talk about when I get there. She says, oh, no, Sugie, oh, no. The book says we get this all down on paper and we look at it. I'm like, oh, God, how can I do that? How am I going to do this? I had one of those marble composition books. I'm glad I started, God bless you, with those marble composition books because one of the things that I like those for is hard to tear out pages. It's hard to hide the evidence of stuff you don't want somebody to see. You can tell that the pages are torn out. So I turned it upside down backwards and I wrote in code those things that she said I had to get down on paper. I figured she would forgive me and so would God because when she heard about this, she would know why it was such an important thing for me to do. Well, I get over to her house, you know, and I'm pacing like a cat on a hot tin roof. I got a Coke and a cigarette, and I'm smoking and talking. And she said, Shooty, sit down and be quiet. And I sat down. She said, I got a few things I want to tell you, and I don't know what she told me. But then, all of a sudden, out of the clear blue sky, she's telling me those code things. And I was looking for my book. I thought she had it, and she understood it. But she was sharing with me her own life. And I started to cry. And I hadn't cried in a long time. Really, I hadn't. I had too much pain. If I cried, I wasn't going to stop. And I knew that. So I choked it back. But not that day. I cried, and I cried, and I cried, and for 3 years I cried. And I told her all that terrible stuff, every nasty, horrible thing about me, and I know that that's not a moral inventory. I know that there are good things about me, but you see, I wasn't there about the good things. I was there about the bad things that kept me from being a free person, that took away my right to freedom, the freedom that God had given me. So it would be a long time before we'd ever address anything good about me. And when we were all done, it took all day long. You know, we took that thing, that whole book, that whole marble composition book, and I sat there in her backyard, and she shredded it up, and she'd light it on fire, and the smoke would go up in the paper. She'd make sure everything was burned. And she said, do you see all that garbage? You see it, how it's burnt? She said, it's all black and nasty. That's been in your soul, and it's gone. Do not look back. You know, the 12 and 12, it talks about this fifth step process in the 12 and 12, and it says something, I don't know exactly what it says, even though I've gone to a step study every week for 30 years. I cannot tell you verbatim what it says. I've had to make a conscious effort not to memorize this stuff, you know, because it's awful if you memorize AA, you know. It really is. You begin to think you know something. But anyhow, it says something like this. It says, you know, as we talk, you know, this relief, you know, we start to get some relief, and we get more relief, and it mounts from moment to moment, and then, you know, and sometimes for some of us, we begin to get a connection with God that we hadn't had before, and, you know, that was not my experience. What happened to me that day, or what I thought happened to me that day, was that I just uncovered this horrible, horrible situation that I had so much work to get right, and I didn't know how I was going to do it. And I left her house feeling very bewildered and very frightened, not exposed, you know, but just frightened about the huge mass of crap that we had uncovered in her living room. And I was driving by driving by this church where we used to go to Mass occasionally when I was a child. I had to go to Mass 3 times a week. It didn't work. It didn't take. And I pulled over in the parking lot, and I sat there in front of St. Rita's Church, and I said, you know, I said to myself, I don't even know why I did this. But I pulled over, and I said, you know, you could go in there today if you wanted to. I didn't. But it was the first time since I'd left my parents' house that I felt like I was worthy to walk into a church. You know, you can't live the way that I live. I wasn't a kitchen drunk. You just can't live the way that I live and not have some pain. You just can't. And I wish I could tell you that, you know, if you do everything in order and you comply to everything, your life will be perfect. It won't be. But God did send me a sailor. I'll tell you about that in a minute. You know, after I did that inventory with Ruby, you know, and I sat in front of that church, she told me that I should do exactly what the book says. The book says, you know, you take this book down and, you know, you look at it. That's what it says, you look at it. And you review your work, you know. Have you done it? Have you done a good job? Did you leave anything out? And I didn't leave anything out. I couldn't think of a thing I left out. I was as honest as I was capable of being at that time. I was completely, totally, thoroughly honest. Now, later on, things came up that I remembered that I took care of, but I didn't on purpose leave anything out. I laid it all out. And the take-home message for me was this. If I am not willing to tell one person in this world everything about me, then none of you can help me. Doesn't make any difference what you do. I have things stored and compartmentalized in places that you'll never, ever get to. That's my truth. You know, she said, take the book down, and if you feel like you did a good job, you know, then you say the 7th step prayer, and then I want you to come back to my house next week. So I got to go to our house twice in 2 weeks. It's a big deal, going to your sponsor's house. And we're going to write that 8th step list. And that was it, you know, because she came from the school of you do the steps once, and then you just stay sober on those maintenance steps, which I still don't know what that means. But anyway, I guess I was supposed to do an inventory thorough enough the first time that I would never have to go sit down and do a big one. That has not been my experience. I have done lots and lots of very big ones. I would say in 30 years I've done 70 of them. sometimes just on one person, but it would be an enormous inventory because I would have developed or a company, or, a lot of ex-husbands and, I might do inventories on specific things like that, but I'd sit down, I'd write all this stuff down. And so anyway, I did it. I did the steps, and I was busy helping carry the message, and God only knows why all those women didn't die. I don't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to help them. I just shared with them, and we drug ourselves from place to place, picking up other drunks and going to meetings, and, life was grand. And at that time in New Orleans, I had, I got a job, I became employable. And, my father, as sad as he was about how things started out, he did pull me aside when Donald was an infant, and he said, you need to get an education because it looks like you're going to have to take care of yourself. Little did he know that there were 3 more husbands in the wings, but I did have to take care of myself. And he sent me to adult education, and I got a diploma from high school, but then I got some college, and it was all in accounting. Now, y'all have known me for 3 minutes. Can you see me as an accountant? I'm very good, very good. I hated it when I was young. I couldn't sit still. And now I like it because there's a lot of solitude. But I retired last year, so it doesn't matter. But anyway, he did do this thing for me. And so after I was sober for a while, I got a job. And I couldn't go to 2 meetings a day. But I was very dedicated to my home group. And my home group, you had to have 2 years to chair a meeting, to chair the meeting there. It was a big meeting. 250 people would come. You'd have to make 3 of those great big old pots of coffee, and you'd have to set up all these rooms and all these chairs. And so, people in AA didn't treat me gingerly. They didn't. They loved me, but they didn't love me in a nice way. They were rough on me. They were really rough on me. The odds of me staying sober were not very good, and that was just the reality. So, this business meeting in January of 1985, they were picking out the chairman for the year, and, I was sitting there, and the only one they had left was March. And I'm sitting there because they took all the end of the months, and they said, "What about you?" I said, "Well, I won't have 2 years until April." So they had a big, long discussion about me in front of me. And half of them voted for me, and the other half voted against me. So then they had to have another vote. And I sat there and watched it all. And went, he don't like me. She don't. I don't think. I had no problem figuring out where I stood in that group. Let me tell you. But I will tell you this: one of the greatest things one of the most fond memories that I have is showing up. So I got to chair March, even though I only had 1 year and 11 months. I got to chair in March, and it's spring, and I get there, and you got to get there at 5 o'clock in the afternoon for the 8 o'clock meeting, and you got to set up all this stuff and get the coffee, and I'm sweating, and I got everything, and everything's done. And now I'm waiting for my friends to come. And I'm sitting at this table in this room. It was in the sanctuary of a church where the big room was. There was a great big red stained glass cross. And the sun set and spilled that room with that glass. And I knew it was an honor and it was a privilege to be of service to my group. I was so grateful that they let me do that. And I am so, so sorry for those of you who have not been allowed that luxury in Alcoholics Anonymous. It was a gift I could never repay. Service was something that I earned by my good behavior, by being a member in good standing. It wasn't something that was thrown at the only body that walked in the door breathing. This was something that you had to earn. And I appreciated service like that, and I've been involved in service all of my sobriety, from my first job as the donut girl, all the way up through general service. I like service, but I like doing what I'm doing now, too. I chaired that group, and I went to meetings, and I carried the message to the very best of my ability. I could read and write, and I did all the stuff that I was supposed to do, and I was the secretary of the group. I had 4 years of sobriety. And the week before, we used to go to Shoney's every Saturday night after the meeting, and we'd stay there till all hours of the day, night. We'd stay there and drink and talk coffee and laugh and all that stuff. It was great. Newcomers could go, because you could afford to buy them a cup of coffee. Now you got to go to steak houses, where only this, And I wonder sometimes, how it must feel to be a newcomer whose pockets are empty. You come to Alcoholics Anonymous and everybody splits for the steakhouse. Do you think, I remember thinking at one meeting, I bet that poor fella thinks we're all going off to a big party and he's the only one that's not invited. I think we need to revisit that. That's a bad habit we've gotten into. And I personally, I don't do it anymore. But it's because I'm too old to eat that late at night. But, I think, there are some moral implications too for me. But, I did all those things, and so there was this one night at Shoney's, and there was this interesting man. I'd never met him before. I didn't know when he came in. And I took one. He was sitting over there smoking a cigarette. And I went, God, look at those eyes. I didn't say that to anybody. I just said that to me. And I had told my third ex-husband that I was gone, and I'd rented a house. And The next Saturday, he showed up at the home group, and I was the secretary, and one of the things was, it said, if you'd like, we believe in home groups. If you need a home group and you'd like to join us, we'd love to have you. Please see the secretary. And I'd stand up and wave, and she'll sign you up. And the sailor walked up with those big, beautiful blue eyes and that crackerjack uniform on. God, they look so good, all that gold hash marks down his arm. Ugh. I signed him up. I had his phone number, put him in the book and everything. Book went around with me, and then I watched him, And then it was a few months later, there was an event. I watched him. I flirted with him. He flirted with me, And a few months later, there was an event. We had an event called Fall Fest. We used to have it out at the lake, and all the gals got all their kids, and we'd all go out there, and everybody'd play. And it was something. He comes riding up on his bike, his 10-speed bicycle, with a girl that I was sponsoring that only had 60 days. Well, I can tell you what. I can tell you how that turned out. I had his phone number, so I called him, and I said, you're not going to do that with her. And he says, I'm not doing anything with her. We were just riding our bikes. So I said, oh, no. We're going to talk. I want to see you at the meeting. So we went to a meeting on a Thursday night, and afterwards he came, and I had to go pick him up because he was on the base, and he we sat in the car, and I said, you know what, she doesn't have enough time, and, I don't want you fooling around with her. And he goes, I'm not fooling around with her. But I kept talking. I didn't hear any of that. And I said, if you want somebody to date and go out with, you're just going to have to settle for me. God is my witness. He'll tell you that today. That's how it happened. He reached across, scooped me up. He said, let's see if it's real, baby. And he kissed me on the mouth, and that was all she wrote. That was in August of 1987. And I FaceTimed him before I came. He said, tell y'all hi. He picked up his 28-year chip on the 26th of April. One of the things that happened is, the kids were home, and we had this life, and he had 2 children from a previous marriage. And, we decided that we needed to be married or he wasn't going to be able to take us wherever the Navy told him to go. And so his ex-wife gave us the kids as a wedding present, so now we had 4 kids. She damn sure did, I'm telling you. She decided to change her life. And ours in the process. It was one of the greatest things in the world, though. Man, it just couldn't be any better, really. I remember my daughter being in Alaska some years back, and she had 3 little children, and she called one day, the block cracked on the engine on one car, and this was going on, and the baby's crying, this one's sick. She goes, Mama, I don't know how you did it. And I said, neither do I. I don't know, we just did it every day, In our house, I told Alicia this story. Our house was the place. It was the safe house. There was drunks there in varying stages of recovery, some shaken. I remember the kids coming home from school one day, and I'd gone over to pick up a friend of ours he'd been drinking. He'd been holed up in his apartment, and he's sitting on the floor with a bottle of rum between his legs. And the kids come in with their hands, and they go, what the hell's going on in here? I'll go, well, We're putting him on an airplane. He's going off to treatment, you know. But, I mean, you know, they were invested in our sobriety, in our recovery, because our lives were good. And I told Alicia this story on the way up here about, you know, we had to sneak, you know, we had all these kids, we had 3 teenagers, and then Kevin, who I would forget to feed sometimes. I felt terrible about that. But, you know, we'd have to sneak around to be alone, you know, and so we'd sleep late when we could. And it was one Saturday morning, I snuck out of the bed, and I was going to go make the coffee. The house was really, really quiet. And I snuck out into the kitchen, and there's this guy from our group sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and reading the paper. I said, Baxter, what are you doing here? He said, having coffee and reading the paper. I said, how'd you get in the house? He said, oh, Bridget let me in. She was going to work. I said, shit. You know, got me and Jerry coffee and snuck back in. I said, we got company already. He goes, God, it's 7 o'clock on Saturday morning. But, I mean, that's the house we lived in. And when we left it, you know, when the Navy finally came along and they said, you got to go. You got to go to sea. Well, I had no idea what all that stuff meant. I found out in a real quick hurry. Oh, boy, that was not a good lesson. I didn't much care for sailors after that. But anyway, you know, when we left New Orleans, we missed that. We missed it really, really bad. And moving is hard. I don't care who you are. I don't care how long you've been sober. I don't care where you got sober or where you're moving to. It is hard. Everything changes. The cadence, I mean, they didn't even say the Lord's Prayer right. They gave the chips at the wrong time. And I mean, they had everything so screwed up, I didn't know how they managed to stay sober in Charleston, South Carolina. I was just outdone with these people. Ugh. And 2 really big things happened. I got a woman who could see through me, and she actually showed me how to work the steps and how to do a 6 and 7. And, you know, I did another inventory, and she is still my sponsor today. I also have a sponsor in waiting. You know, Rose has been my sponsor since 1990, and she had a stroke about 1.5 years ago. And I have a very dear friend, Nancy, and Nancy and I are real close. Nancy's been sober for a long time. And I said, oh, my God, what am I going to do? And she goes, well, you know, you can't do anything while you know you're not going to do anything while Rose is still alive. And I thought to myself, well, I got to do something. I mean, Rose's mother lived to be 106. She's only 85, you know? I mean, shit, what am I going to do? Nancy says, we'll work together, and you just take care of Rose. And Rose has gotten better a little bit from her stroke and stuff. But, I mean, you know, I take this thing seriously, this relationship with this woman. She doesn't want anything from me. I don't have to clean her house. I don't have to do anything for her. She loves me. She wants me to be happy. She wants me to have all of the things that are available to me, living a sober life in Alcoholics Anonymous. And, you know, she's not on a pedestal like a statue. She says, you know, that's why people call them pigeons. You know, that's when they think you're a statue, pigeons will shit all over you. That's what she said. I would never say anything like that. She's not somebody that I have on a pedestal that I look up to. She's the person, she and Nancy, they're holding the light. They are lighting my way. They're lighting my journey through sobriety. She's what I want to be like when I grow up. I aspire to her serenity and peacefulness, her love, her unconditional love. And I've watched both of those women go through tragic things with such grace and dignity, and it's what I want to be. You know, now, you know, people come to AA younger and younger, you know, and these young people, they'll go, Miss Angela. I go, God, please don't do that. Please. Not because of my age, but because it puts me in a position not equal to them. How can they be honest with me if I'm an authority figure? You know, I got to be, they're not my peers, and I know that. You know, I'm not your peer. I'm not your peer. You know, you're somebody who is further along the road than I. And I am so deeply grateful to you. But also, I can't put myself on a different plane, or they won't hear me. They won't trust me. So I, you know, kind of struggle with that, you know, especially after I have a session about how nobody respects anybody anymore. But you know, it's kind of hard to meld those two things together. But it is, I think it is really important. I do think that we need to talk about it. I think there are a lot of things in AA that need to be talked about that we don't talk about. You know, what happens when we get older in AA? You know, I briefly, well, I told you that, you know, my mother had a problem with alcohol, and my mother got sober on Founder's Day of 2010, and she stayed sober for a year. It was one of the greatest honors of my life to give her 1-year chip. You know, I wouldn't even ask God for something like that. I wouldn't pray for that. I prayed for her, but I didn't pray for the outcome I was interested in. And so when she drank again, I wasn't really disappointed. I was sad. You know, my sisters were mad. You know, and you know, to watch her, you know, because you know the theme of your convention is, you know, this isn't a destination we reach. It's a journey that we're on. You know, I watched my mother, you know, at my anniversary the other night, sitting in the front row, proud of me because I have 30 years, and now she has 30 days again. You know, it has to be enough. It has to be enough. I don't know that I can say anything more about myself. I think I've talked myself out. Again, I'm so very deeply grateful to be invited to functions like this. Y'all did a good job. I can't wait to eat some of the food. I think the boys should wear their beads. I'm grateful. I'm grateful to be in this Friday night position, so the rest of the weekend we can just kick back and get to know each other better. I thank you so very, very much. That's that award I was talking about.
I think we got a great talk going on here. Thanks for watching the channel. Taper Dave here. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with, and it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, oop, out, in, up, down. And then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. what that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right. But I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.